What we are taking a look at is the abdominal cavity, and the very first structure that you typically see when you open up any mammal dissection is this large liver. The liver actually has 4 lobes to it, and this is where the umbilical vein connected, and it takes the nutrients to the liver so the liver can process them and then deliver it to the rest of the body. The green structure that you can see here, that is actually the gallbladder. And the gallbladder is where we store bile that is produced in the liver, and bile is released slowly into the small intestine to help with lipid digestion. It does a process called lipid emulsification, which essentially turns the lipids into their constituent parts, such as the fatty acid tails, the glycerols, and that sort of a thing. Now, if we lift up the lung from the thoracic cavity, you can also see this thin muscle that rests on top of the liver. That's the diaphragm. I've cut through it so we can actually follow where the esophagus travels and comes in contact with the stomach. This structure that is actually kind of wrapping around the stomach is called the spleen. The spleen is referred to as sometimes the blood cell graveyard. This is actually where red blood cells get stored, and this is also where they get broken down after they have worked so hard that they're ready to be broken down into their parts and be built into new blood cells. Now, if you lift up the spleen and you lift up the stomach, you can see that there is this connective tissue. I'm going to scrape through that. And the reason for scraping through that is so that way you can see this very grainy structure before we actually get into the intestines. Now, if you mess with this area too much, that tissue will just become mush. But this is the pancreas. The pancreas is responsible for secreting many, many different enzymes into the small intestine that first comes off of the stomach, called the duodenum. And this is a structure that you want to look into a little bit more closely and discover what enzymes it actually makes and what those enzymes are responsible for doing. In addition to its functions with the digestive system, it also has endocrine functions. This is where our blood glucose levels are regulated, and this is where insulin is produced. And this organ, even though it doesn't seem like much, is very, very important for the overall function of our body. After we swallow a bite of food, it travels through the esophagus and it will enter the stomach through the cardiac valve or cardiac sphincter. A sphincter is basically a circular band of smooth muscle that encompasses the opening, and it can control how much food gets in and prevents backflow of food. Inside the stomach itself is where mechanical digestion begins. It's where our food physically is churned and mixes with water, with mucus, with hydrochloric acid, and protein digesting enzymes. From the stomach, the food will travel to the small intestine. This end of the stomach is referred to as the pyloric end, and this is where the pyloric sphincter would be. The pyloric sphincter is responsible for controlling how much of the chyme that is produced in the stomach makes it to the small intestine at any point in time. The initial portion of the small intestine is referred to as the duodenum, and this is where we will have digestive enzymes coming from the pancreas, which you can actually see part of the pancreas right here. This is also where the bile duct will connect. And if you look in this area, you can see the connections all in this area. I would have to lift it up further so you could see where the pancreas is draining into it, but this is where everything starts to enter. So as food makes its way into this region, this is the primary location where absorption and digestion takes place. This region of the small intestine that I'm holding up, all this webbing and all of the blood vessels you're seeing, is actually the mesentery. It's what holds our intestines together and in position. And all of these arteries that you can see, all the pink, there's also veins in here. These are responsible for taking the nutrients and delivering it back to our bloodstream. These are called the mesenteric arteries and veins. Right. Now, as we keep going, you can see that I'm sort of walking along that mesentery. And to try to orient you, this is the duodenum, and it actually wraps underneath the large intestine and it pops back out on the other side. And we go through this whole network because the more surface area you have, the more digestion can actually happen. Now we are looking specifically at the intestines, and the very tightly coiled portion of the intestines is the small intestine. The small intestine is longer than the large intestine, but it has a smaller diameter. The small intestine is also broken into 3 regions, which include the duodenum, which comes directly from the stomach, and then it goes into the jejunum and then into the ileum. Now, the jejuno-ileum portion is extensive, and while they look different microscopically and they serve slightly different functions, macroscopically we're not going to be able to tell the difference. So from before, we could follow from the stomach back here into the small intestine, and the small intestine will actually wrap around and it pops back through right here, and it continues into the additional coils that we see. And I'm walking my fingers along it just so you can kind of see where this goes. And we are going to come to the large intestine, which starts to have a little bit more of a green color to it. And that's because this is where the fecal matter starts to accumulate and will get compacted in the large intestine. So the portion where the ileum runs into the colon is often kind of looks like a T structure. There is a dead end region here that's referred to as the cecum. The cecum is a lot smaller in omnivorous and carnivorous organisms because this is the area that we would digest more of the fibrous material. If you were to look at a rabbit, for example, this end would be much larger. Then, as we keep going, we can move into the colon, and the colon is broken into some sections just like the small intestine is. And depending on the region that you're in, it moves slightly differently, but this is the compacted area. And what I want to show you is as it kind of wraps back around, you'll see the descending colon here, which is what turns into the rectum and comes out the anus. And this is where you get that accumulation of the fecal matter. Now, we know that these pigs are not eating their food, but they are still getting nutrients through the umbilical cord, and they're also swallowing amniotic fluid.